Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our second session of the day. We entitled it Study Performance, and we're going to talk about how to enroll your study on time, on budget, and of course, while preserving clean data integrity. So we could have titled it Running the Perfect Study. A little bit about me, very little bit. We're not here to talk about me, but I do have a sort of an interesting background. I've been in clinical research and clinical manufacturing for over 30 years. First as a contract manufacturer of biologics, which is a very interesting experience since we started before biologics were really quite approved by FDA to be contract manufactured. But that went very well, and I've spent the second part of my career in clinical research, which is a lot more interesting to me and certainly does tie the two together. Being a manufacturer and then ultimately being in clinical research has been an amazing experience for me, as well as the fact that I did spend a few years as a CPA for Ernst & Young, and I learned a lot about finances there. So putting that all together, I've been very fortunate to have the experience I have in the field of biopharmaceuticals and especially in the research sector. So today's session, just to give you a little bit of a preview of what we're going to discuss, when we talk about the perfect study, we will talk about how to ensure that you enroll on time. Because of the growth in clinical trials, you're going to need to use other venues to ensure success in that. But then, of course, with exploring new venues comes concerns about whether they're perceived or real, concerns about data integrity. So basically in today's session, we're going to talk about some of the best approaches, best practices in order to ensure that your studies come in on time and on budget. And I just want to finish up the preview with a quick story about a client that I had. And I asked her, we'd run several studies for this global pharma. And I asked the head of clinical research, how can my company get formal, preferred provider agreement with your company? And she said, Stephanie, you are a preferred provider because your company is the only company I've ever worked with, the only CRO that delivers what you promise every single time. And so I thought a lot about that, and I think that's really what it's all about. Over-promising and under-delivering, those days are absolutely gone. Pharmaceutical clients, such as most of the folks that are attending JP Morgan, hopefully in our audience, you don't believe it anyway, and you absolutely don't want to take a risk on a CRO that promises you the moon and doesn't even deliver, anything as high as Mount Everest, much less the moon. So we understand you have investors, you have boards of directors, and you have to deliver as promised, which means so do we. And so it's really our mantra at Cromos Pharma, deliver as promised, and we'll talk about kind of how we do that through the rest of the presentation. We're obviously going to focus a lot on Eastern Europe and Eurasian locations, post-Soviet, we call them sometimes, or the CIS countries. But this chart here shows you the growth in the entire European Union combined with the countries that are not member states and are still in Europe. And as you can see, the size of the pharma market in this region is quite large, and it is quite growing actively. And one of the key components of running clinical research in an attractive market is that to be an attractive market, you kind of want to see the pharma end use market growing as well. So in our regions, you can see here that there's quite a lot of pharmaceutical demand, and it's growing very robustly. The IQVIA, whom I'm sure you all know, we're not quite as large as IQVIA, but they do an awful lot of good research and present data. According to IQVIA, the pharmaceutical markets, and we're talking about drug markets here now, not research markets necessarily, but the pharmaceutical markets across the globe are growing quite robustly. And according to IQVIA, the average growth over the last, 10 to 15, 20 years has ranged in the area of 5%. I've seen other estimates higher, as much as up to 8% per year, and that's compounded. IQVIA also says that the growth, going forward in 2019 to 2024 is going to be, quite a lot higher. And but other estimates I've seen, range as high as 17% over the next 5-6 years. And that's quite aggressive. That's huge growth. And it also means that there will be growth in clinical research that accompanies the growth in the end use markets. Now, one of the caveats that I have to give you here is that a lot of these numbers that we're going to present today were prepared, and the analysis was done, and reports were issued before COVID sort of changed the world. And so the forecast could be slightly less, but I don't think they're going to be much less, because there's going to be some bolus of demand catch up over the next couple of years from the slowdown in COVID. So I think net we're going to see this kind of growth. In terms of the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about how to run, quote, the perfect study. And I'm not sure the perfect study can be defined the same way during COVID as it might have been defined 2 years ago. But we're going to make allowances for that. We're going to call out certain COVID-related items that may affect some of the things that we say. Hopefully, they won't be affected in too much of a negative way. The market growth, again, has also been shown in the Brazil, some of the other markets that have not been traditionally robust, Brazil, China, and India. And if those of you who are old enough, like I am, to remember about 20 years ago, when everyone wanted to run research and get drugs approved in the BRIC nations. And the BRIC nations, of course, are Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And honestly, the only market that's really done very well over those years has been Russia, because Brazil has taken a while to come along. Now it's doing really well now. Their regulatory process is greatly streamlined. China is a bit behind the curve, but they're coming on strong. And India was doing gangbusters until some, slowdowns that we all are familiar with, things that occurred with the DCGI maybe 10 or probably 15 years ago now, where the Indian research market was basically stopped for a while. It took a pause, and now it's coming back very, very strong. But the growth in these markets has also caused something to occur in the more, I would say, the more mature markets of Russia, because some studies are migrating to these newer venues. Now, of course, when you move your studies from an established venue to a new one, there are always the perceived and in some cases quite real concerns about data integrity, regulatory compliance, etc. So this is something we should all be mindful of. I'm a big believer in taking research into new markets, but that must be done very carefully. And the data integrity, of course, has to be the end result, because that's what we're all in the business to achieve, right? This graphic here is just a summary of the percent breakdown of the drug market globally, which last time I heard a believable number was over $1 trillion per annum, and I've seen estimates as high as 1.27 trillion. I think that's a bit high, but in any event, it's huge and it is growing. And of course, as you can see from this chart, the big drug hog here, and the majority of drugs are being the end use market in North America, USA, and Canada. And Europe is second with almost 20% of end use market. And Japan is quite large for a tiny country, also quite large as well. India's not broken out here, but it's a growing market, and of course China is growing very, very fast. So I guess the summary here is, okay, all the drug markets, global drug markets growing, clinical research is growing, and I think we have a slide somewhere, I hope, maybe not yet, but down the road, that's going to show the growth in the clinical research, which interestingly is different from the growth of the end-use markets. So this is our pharmaceutical market chart, very, very similar, and we've talked enough about it. And we'll make a note here that Africa, Asia, and Australia are down there with a good chunk of the market, and also very rapidly growing. So here's the one I like. This is our hockey stick projection that shows that not only are the pharma markets growing, and of course you would expect clinical research to grow at a similar rate to pharmaceutical drug sales, and especially new drug development. But this hockey stick is actually shows quite a lot more robust, or we could call it almost exponential growth in clinical research. And the sourcing here is clinicaltrials.gov, and I think UDRA CT we also use. And I think most of us who are in this space understand that as the demand for drugs increases, and especially for innovative drugs, of course, and as we get more and more sophisticated with data and start to use real world data and artificial intelligence and all the great things that characterize the future of our industry, the regulatory authorities have become data hungry and have asked for more studies and more data. And so it's not surprising that the number of and the growth rate of clinical research across the globe has increased even more than the growth of the pharmaceutical drug market. So what's the so what of that? So who cares? Okay. Here's the so what. As you can see on this map, most of the focus on clinical research has been in the end-use markets, and you can see the big fat numbers in US and Western Europe, and smaller numbers, of course, in countries that are, less developed, that are smaller drug markets. But the interesting thing is that some of the countries and regions, and we'll take Russia for an example, 6,387 trials across Russia. Well, that's nothing compared to the size and the population of Russia. And so what the takeaway here, I think we should all realize, is in addition to the areas such as MENA and South Africa and South America, and not just Brazil, but the other countries in South America, where clinical research is really starting to burgeon and boom, but it's still not quite as mature as it is in US, Western Europe, and of course, even in Eastern and Central Europe. That leaves us an awful lot of opportunity to continue to explore the regions of Central and Eastern Europe, for example, to help to increase the enrollment potential and the likelihood of succeeding in enrollment and timeline and budget with studies that we're planning from here forward. And certainly COVID adds to that when you have risk of COVID site shutdowns or difficulty enrolling patients because they just don't want to go to site for fear of catching COVID or what have you. Then we have to be much more careful and conservative about putting up some extra venues and putting up some extra sites in those venues to make sure that we reach those enrollment goals. Now, reaching enrollment goals, and I know everybody concentrates mostly on enrollment, because if you don't meet your enrollment goals and timeline, your whole study is going to be cratered or severely impacted by that. But we have to remember that that's just the first step. Getting a study enrolled is just half the battle. The rest of the battle is making sure that it's conducted properly, compliantly, with high quality, that patient data is accepted, it's clean, it has solid data integrity that is not only accepted by the major regulatory authorities such as FDA and EMA, but that there are no perceptual issues. And one of the things I can honestly say that I'm very, very happy about in the long time that I've been involved with studies in Eastern and Central Europe is that 10 or 20 years ago, every single sponsor I talked to wanted to know how we assured data integrity. And now, especially with sponsors who have worked in these regions, it hardly ever is questioned, hardly ever. And the FDA's, very, very good with accepting the data. And so it's really not an issue anymore. But if a company, such as a small company that may be early stage, venture financed or what have you, has never experienced working in Eastern Europe, there may be questions. And I'm happy to show that these are perceptual issues, not real, but perception is reality. So we have to be very careful to address any concerns that any of our sponsors would have, and we can do that pretty easily. This slide, my team loves it. I don't like it because it shows that the USA has a lot more actions that were required, in their inspections from FDA, and we'll talk about 483s. We probably won't talk about 483s. But because the numbers of FDA audits and EMA audits even in Eastern and Central Europe are much lower, so our N numbers are tiny compared to those in, for example, in US or Germany. It's not really statistically valid, but this chart here does give you a lot of confidence, I would hope, that our venues in Eastern Europe are routinely audited by EMA, FDA, major venues, and they do extremely well. We had one inspector from EMA recently tell us that our sites were heaven compared to, let's just say, rest of world. Anyway, so that was a huge compliment to us, and we were very happy to hear that. In order to talk a little bit more about the ability to not rescue, but rescue is a word that I don't like using, but we do a lot of rescues at Cromos Pharma, and any good CRO that can enroll certainly does a lot of rescues. We'd much rather start working on your study from the very beginning. But in order to make the value proposition of working in Eastern and Central Europe clearer, we chose to sort of down select on Russia and walk through the way things work in Russia, the way they're structured, so that we can explain to you the benefits, and you can sort of extrapolate this to the other Eastern and Central European venues, because while they're quite different in their regulatory procedures from one country to another, in general, the quality, the ability to enroll, the economic benefits, and so forth among these venues are fairly consistent. Russia gets the most attention, of course, because they're the largest, and Russia's been at this for a long time. So as you can see here, the 42%, the big pie here, indicates how many, what percent of Russian studies are international multi-center, which obviously probably means FDA, EMA, and other large bodies. And so, sponsors who ask me, well, do you guys understand GCPs? I'm like, I understand they don't know, and because they haven't worked in Russia. But from in the 15 years I've been involved with Russia, Ukraine, et cetera, 90+%, maybe 95% of all the studies we work on are for either FDA or EMA or both, or US or European companies that want to get their drugs approved in Russia. So they also run their studies in Russia. So yes, we understand GCPs, and we understand FDA regs, and we understand European EMA regs. Another way to slice the pie is even more compelling. As you see here, almost 3/4 of the studies that have run in Russia, or running in 2019, I think, were phase 3. And what does that mean? Well, it means obviously big enrollment, lots of sites, lots of governance, and a whole lot of scrutiny by the regulatory authorities, because phase 3 studies are pivotal, pre-approval, and they are highly scrutinized, and the data is scrutinized. So the fact that clients come to our regions time after time after time to run phase 3 studies is in and of itself sort of a pretty good proof that we're doing a pretty good job over there. Clients wouldn't be coming back time after time. So this is a very, very focused to Russia only, and I'm going to move through it because I don't want to keep everyone past the time. And another slide here just shows the growth of clinical trials in Russia, and you can actually see that in the last few years, some of these newer venues that are less experienced and less sophisticated, but also very promising for the future, have stolen some, if you will, market share from Russia, and that's all that is. There's no Ministry of Health or government initiative to reduce studies, so they've trickled down a bit, and what this means is really good news for the rest of us because there's a lot of capacity yet to run studies in Russia, Ukraine, etc. And I may also mention the same point with Hungary. Hungary, Czech, Poland, these are wonderful places to run studies because the same reasons. Standard of care, medical care is great. There are plenty of sites and experience and patients to accrue, and so it's not quite, the economics are a little bit, I would say that a little bit higher than they are in Russia and Ukraine, but still much, much better and favorable as opposed to Western Europe and certainly the United States, which kind of holds the umbrella over the rest of us on how expensive it is to do research. Nothing against the US. You know, I think research, certainly for FDA, should have some US component as well as for EMA, European component. But when you have to do the heavy lifting and pay for huge numbers of patients enrollment, you cannot beat the value proposition of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. So I'm gonna have just a quick sip here because it's getting dry. A lot of people ask about regulatory timelines and regulatory issues in Russian, with the ministry, in Ukraine, in Georgia, and other venues that we work in. And one of the things I want to be very clear about, and now, and maybe this wasn't the case 25 years ago, but I can tell you now that the Russian ministry and all the ministries in Eastern Europe are very, very insistent upon compliance, upon the quality of their sites. You know, sites have to be approved. Unlike US, sites have to be approved to run studies in Russia, and sometimes they are unapproved and they're taken off the list. The Russian ministry, I have seen, not just in Russia, but Ukraine and Georgia, where they're much more strict about the protocol design, the ethics of the study, and we can go and say, but FDA approved it. But FDA said we need to use a placebo, and even though, you know, the patients are quite ill and we don't really want to use a placebo. And our ministries in Eastern Europe now are pushing back. I mean, of course, they love the fact that studies running in the US has been approved by FDA. But where that used to be all you needed to say, now they're saying, well, you know what? We're different and we don't agree. But fortunately, we have very good success with our regulatory approvals. And I could say that if it's approved in EMA and FDA, we'll pretty sure we'll get it approved in our venues as well. But they definitely are getting a lot more sophisticated and a lot more quality minded, and even biostatistical minded. 15 years ago, you could take a biostats plan to Russia and they go, okay, yeah, 30 patients. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, 30 patients. Okay. And now they're very, very sophisticated and sometimes tougher than FDA. So another reason to use these venues is that the standards of healthcare are just as good, or I would say as an American, almost as good as they are in the US. They're very comparable. There are a lot of patients there. And the difference is that with the healthcare system the way it is in some of these countries, including Russia, Ukraine, the PIs are, first of all, very motivated to do clinical research because it's much more lucrative for them than being just, practicing physicians, number one. Number two, their patients don't get access to Western drugs, especially the more expensive biologics, the way we do here in the US. There's no private insurance, well, not no, but very little private insurance that compensates for that. So what we find in Russia, Ukraine, and our regions is that the docs really want to bring their patients into these studies because they're going to get great care and access to great medicine that the docs cannot provide to their patients outside of the venue of a clinical trial. So in addition to the quality, we can count on patient enrollment, patient compliance. They want to stay in the study, and a lot of support from the PIs because this is really good for them financially, but it's great for their patients in terms of the quality of healthcare that can be delivered in a clinical trial setting. So the next section here is, and I'm going to go through it quickly because I don't know how we are for time, but we might be running a bit long. This is our flow chart, and the next slide is some verbiage that explains the flow chart. But simply stated, these two slides are an attempt to show how the healthcare system in Eastern European, sort of post-Soviet or CIS nations differs from the U.S. Go back to the slide. So there are local clinics, just like we visit in the U.S. There are some private clinics. We're going to ignore them because it's 5%, and I like the 80-20 rule. When a patient is quite ill, they go to the next stage, which is a diagnostic treatment clinic. And if they need further help, they go to the next stage, which is a larger hospital, more regional and multidisciplinary. But let's say in the case of oncology, they will end up at a specialized regional or specialized hospital that may be, sorry, I didn't mean to switch that. A specialized hospital, for example, in St. Petersburg or Moscow, one of the large cities, where, if we have a hospital that sees 100 cases of liver cancer in a year, these guys are going to see 1,000. And so it's quite easy to see how well they can enroll. And in fact, one of the kind of interesting metrics around this is if you have you need a large patient population, but it's a sort of a mild to moderate, let's say psoriasis. You're not going to end up in the specialized huge hospitals in St. Petersburg and Moscow. You're going to end up in the local and regional clinics that see these patients. And dermatology and immunology are really great to enroll in this region. But if you're working in cardiology with some very, very sick people, or in oncology, it's possible to go to the large hospitals, the large cities, and set up 3 sites, and through referrals of these local regional networks, you could enroll hundreds literally of patients. So we've proven time and again that in just in Russia, we've been able to enroll hundreds, for example, in biosimilar studies in a very, very short period of time, with very good attention to quality. So basically what we've said, and I hope have established, is that Russia has ample population to enroll. There's some more information here about how that works specifically. Enrollment, let's say, is not an issue for us there or in Ukraine for that matter. How do we know, though, how to tell you, the sponsor, how many patients we can provide to you, and over what period of time, how many sites we'll need, and actually stick to it? And we will stick to it because we have a billing mechanism that requires that we deliver as promised, because we will put our money where our promises are. In other words, we take financial penalties if we don't deliver. Most of the time we deliver. We're very, very sure about that. We don't like to take those financial penalties. But we we have a sort of an iterative process. So if we're looking to do a sort of initial feasibility for you, we call it a capability analysis. It's sort of a high level, what's the landscape look like? Do we have the patients? Where are they? How many studies are running in each of our venues that might compete for patients? And then we come down to a strategy of how to enroll, but we're not going to tell you in 2 days, oh, well, I've got site X, Y, and Z in Moscow, and they're going to give me 3 patients per month and 3.5 and 5.5. That is a long process, which requires detailed feasibility questionnaires, close look at the protocol. We love to get the protocol when it's still in draft because we can do a much better job getting feedback from the PIs that we work with all the time, who are happy to review and give us feedback about what could be a problem for enrollment or a problem for the protocol. So it's a long process. No 2-day overnight promises about what we can deliver. But the important thing here is when we tell you what we can deliver, we will deliver it, and because we will know. So this is just a quick overview of capability to feasibility to formal feasibility, sites ID, and then the rates per site per month, and then the last step being we'll get the approval and we will schedule the site initiation visits, and by that time we will have pre-screening logs and numbers from those sites and sometimes also from the referral sites that work with them. So this slide just explains that a little bit more depth, but this is the way it works, and this is how we know our numbers are going to be correct. Data integrity. Data integrity is all about quality. It's all about choosing the right sites, the right study teams, experienced CRAs. 75% of our CRAs are medical doctors, and there's a reason for that, but it's basically economic. They do much better in clinical research, and we love that because most of our CRAs can actually assist medical monitoring if called upon to do that. I'm probably one of the 5% of Cromos employees that's not an MD. I feel a little left out. So we try to keep our CRAs assigned to given therapeutic area indications. For example, we've got guys that are and ladies that are great in oncology, some in ophthalmology, dermatology. So we try to keep them in their their areas of expertise, and we also try very hard to keep them with their sites. They get to know their sites. They get into relationships with the PIs, the sub-Is, and even the coordinators. We try very, very hard to keep that in place and to make our sites feel supported and to give them the continuity of working with us. It's extremely important. We also have backups CRAs that we train in-house. A lot of times are in-house CRAs. They're familiar with the protocol and can support the CRAs that are on site. And these guys then learn and they get trained that way. So they become very valuable as study support and ultimately as on-site CRAs. We also try very hard not to spread our CRAs across more than 2 protocols. It's not always possible, but we try very hard because we believe our CRAs have to be completely focused on your protocol, your design, and it's very hard to expect high quality when you've spread them too thin. So we try not to do that at all. Another thing we build into our methodology is quality by design or continuous quality improvement. We have it really vary for our size, and we're small, mid-size, but we have a very robust quality management system. We've been audited, by regulatory bodies. We even collaborated with Ministry of Health to work on sessions to train other CROs. We're really committed to quality. Our head of operations in Europe is, hand in glove with our head of quality, not from any reporting perspective, of course, but they work really well together. And he's one of those operating people that calls quality in on, I need an audit here. I want you to look at this. And that's so important that they work together, and of course they don't report to the same people, obviously. We track our metrics to assure the data integrity and quality of our studies. We have KPIs, they're tracked in our CTMS system and reviewed at all the sponsor meetings, which are often weekly, especially in the early stages, and at internal meetings. And we also have quality meetings quarterly with management that includes analysis of CAPA aging, and management reviews of other quality metrics like QC of TMF, which we do throughout the study. And we also, one of the things COVID has helped us improve, actually, is tracking deviations and analyzing, because as you probably are aware, under COVID, we have to separate COVID-related protocol deviations, but we still have to analyze them and categorize them the same way. And this methodology is not only good for sponsors, of course, because I think we all know that the agencies will look at COVID-related deviations as in a much, I would say, more favorable light rather than a deviation for absolutely no reason. But it's made us a lot more careful about looking for deviations and making sure they're properly analyzed, categorized, and reported. And this has been one of the few positives of COVID for us. So I think that's about it, and certainly open for questions and or comments on how your organization, deals with meeting these timelines and budgets. And I thank you all again for your attention and for your attendance.